The air in the grand crystal ballroom was thick with the scent of vintage champagne and the shallow lies of the city's elite. To anyone else, it was the height of luxury. But to Anika Brown, it smelled like the end of her endurance. Every step she took across the polished marble felt like a marathon run on broken glass. Beneath the crisp, white collar of her waitress uniform, a jagged map of agony pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a parting gift from the men she once called home, who had mistaken her silence for a license to destroy her. "More wine, sir," she murmured, her voice a fragile wisp of smoke. Hyeon-Jun Gim didn't look up. He sat at the corner table with the terrifying stillness of a loaded weapon. A dark, faded tattoo peeked out from beneath his tailored sleeve, a silent warning of a past he had tried to bury in the shadows of this very room. For weeks, he had been the only one to notice the way Anika's hands shook when the music got too loud. Suddenly, the warm glow of the chandeliers exploded into a blinding, white static. Anika's grip failed. The heavy lead crystal tray tilted, and the sound of shattering glass tore through the room like a gunshot. "Anika." A voice barked, a command, not a plea. As the world tilted and the floor rushed up to meet her, the dangerous stranger moved with a speed that defied his cold exterior. Before her knees could strike the marble, massive, warm hands locked around her waist, anchoring her limp body against the solid heat of his chest. "Keep your eyes on me," Hyeon-Jun growled, his controlled mask finally fracturing. But as he adjusted his grip to lift her, his thumb caught her sleeve, dragging the fabric back. In the unforgiving glare of the gala lights, the horrific, deep purple bruises on her mahogany skin were exposed for every oblivious socialite to see. Hyeon-Jun's breath hitched, a low, guttural vibration that sounded like a predator finding its mate wounded. He didn't just catch a falling waitress, he had just declared a silent, lethal war on whoever had touched her. The mirror in Anika's cramped bathroom was a cruel witness. At 5 in the morning, the fluorescent bulb flickered with a rhythmic hum that felt like a needle against her temples. She leaned in close, her breath fogging the glass, and began the ritual of the mask. She reached for the heavy-duty concealer, the one she'd bought with tips she was supposed to save for rent. To the world, she was Anika Brown, reliable, invisible, and unbreakable. She had spent years perfecting the art of being okay, convinced that as long as no one saw the damage wasn't real. She didn't realize that by holding the pieces of her life together so tightly, she was only ensuring that when she finally shattered, there would be nothing left to salvage. She grabbed her keys, slung her bag over her good shoulder, and stepped out into the gray morning light. She would work the double shift. She would carry the heavy trays. She would endure. Because in Anika's world, the only thing more dangerous than the pain was the truth. Hyeon-Jun Gim sat in the dim perimeter of the ballroom, a glass of amber liquid sweating against his palm, untouched. To the sea of tuxedoed men and silk-draped women swirling under the chandeliers, he was a ghost, a man whose presence was felt like a drop in barometric pressure, yet whose name was never spoken aloud. He liked it that way. In his world, being seen was a liability, but seeing was a superpower. His eyes, cold and analytical, didn't follow the high-pitched laughter of the debutantes or the aggressive posturing of the CEOs. Instead, they were anchored to the girl in the white collar. Anika. He had learned her name from a discarded shift schedule weeks ago, but he had learned her soul by watching her move. He knew the specific, forced tilt of her chin. He recognized the way her left shoulder dipped a fraction of an inch every time she reached for a fresh bottle of wine, a microscopic flinch that she masked with a practiced, radiant smile. Hyeon-Jun knew that walk. It wasn't the gait of a tired worker, it was the careful, deliberate stride of a soldier crossing a minefield. It was the walk of someone who was physically holding themselves together by sheer force of will, terrified that a single sudden movement would cause their entire reality to shatter. He had seen that look in the mirrors of safe houses and in the eyes of men who had survived things they shouldn't have. It was the unmistakable signature of a secret. He watched her navigate the crowded floor, her movements fluid yet strangely brittle. When a boisterous guest accidentally bumped her shoulder, the color drained from her face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled, yet her smile never wavered. It was a masterpiece of deception. Hyeon-Jun felt a familiar, dark heat stir in his chest, a protective instinct he had spent years trying to drown. He wasn't a good man, he was a man who understood the mechanics of violence better than the mechanics of grace. And as he watched Anika struggle to maintain her balance against the weight of a lead crystal tray, he saw the minute tremor in her hands. She was fading. The light in her eyes was flickering like a dying candle, and the elites around her were too blinded by their own reflection to notice. He leaned forward, the shadows of the corner deepening the hollows of his face, his jaw tightening until it ached. He didn't want to care. He had come here to disappear, to atone, to be still. But as Anika turned toward the center of the room, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that only he seemed to hear, Hyeon-Jun realized that the storm he had been running from had finally found a new shore. He set his glass down on the linen-covered table with a soft, final click. He didn't know who had hurt her, but as he watched her stagger, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was about to find out. The clock on the ballroom wall was no longer a measurement of time, it was a countdown to a collapse Anika could no longer prevent. Every second felt like a physical weight pressing down on her spine, threatening to snap the fragile thread of her composure. Her vision had begun to fray at the edges, a soft, fuzzy vignette creeping into her field of vision, turning the glittering guests into ghostly smears of light and shadow. She stood at the service station, her fingers cramping as she gripped the edges of a massive lead crystal tray. It was loaded with heavy carafes of red wine and weighted decanters, a burden that felt like a mountain in her current state. Her breath was coming in short, panicked bursts, her lungs refusing to expand fully against the constriction of her bruised ribs. She could feel the foundation of her makeup beginning to fail, the heat of the room and the cold sweat of her skin threatening to reveal the secrets she had so carefully painted over that morning. Just 10 more minutes, she lied to herself, the words a silent prayer behind her teeth. Just across the floor. She took the first step. The floor seemed to roll beneath her like the deck of a ship in a storm. The chatter of the gala, the clinking of silverware, the booming laughter of men in silk ties, distorted into a deafening, metallic roar. She focused on a single point across the room, a distant pillar of gold, and forced her legs to move. One foot in front of the other. A slow, agonizing march through a sea of oblivious luxury. Halfway there, the world tilted. A sharp, white-hot spike of pain shot from her arm through her entire nervous system, a reminder that the body has limits even when the spirit refuses to acknowledge them. Her muscles, starved of oxygen and pushed past the point of exhaustion, simply went quiet. It wasn't a choice, it was a systemic failure. Her right knee buckled first, hitting the marble with a sickening thud that was swallowed by the swell of the orchestra. The heavy tray groaned, the crystal decanter sliding toward the edge like a slow-motion disaster. Anika reached out, her hand clawing at the empty air for a balance she no longer possessed. She felt the gravity take hold, the weight of the tray pulling her down into the abyss she had spent the last 12 hours running from. The unbreakable Anika Brown was finally breaking. As the silver tray began its descent toward the floor, she closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of shattering glass to announce her defeat to the world. She was ready for the impact. She was ready for the end. But as her body gave way to the pull of the earth, the cold, hard marble never came. The world didn't end with a bang, it ended with a terrifying, weightless silence. As Anika's knees betrayed her, the centrifugal force of the falling tray dictated the rhythm of her descent. The lead crystal, so heavy only moments ago, seemed to hover in the air, suspended by the laws of a physics that had suddenly slowed to a crawl. Red wine escaped the necks of the decanters in arched, crimson ribbons, catching the light of the chandeliers like liquid rubies before they could shatter against the floor. Anika felt the air rush past her ears. Her hair, pinned so tightly that morning into a mask of professional perfection, finally gave way. The pin snapped, and her dark tresses unspooled in a chaotic motion blur, fanning out around her face like ink dropped into water. She saw the underside of the mahogany tables, the polished shoes of the wealthy, and the blurred, panicked faces of the elite who were only now realizing that the invisible girl was finally becoming visible. Her right arm, the one she had guarded with her life, swung outward in a desperate, instinctive search for purchase. The movement was a streak of white and brown against the dark backdrop of the ballroom, the fabric of her sleeve riding up just enough to reveal the edge of the secret she had bled to keep. She felt the cold draft of the air conditioning hit her skin, a sensation so sharp it felt like a brand. This was the collapse of everything. It wasn't just her body giving up, it was the structural failure of her dignity, her safety, and her survival. She was a star burning out, trailing a wake of spilled wine and broken expectations. The floor was inches away now, a cold, indifferent expanse of white marble that promised to end the pain by replacing it with a final, crushing impact. She braced for the strike, for the sound of her own bones echoing the break of the crystal. She was ready to be broken, ready to let the darkness that had been nibbling at the edges of her vision finally swallow her whole. The momentum was absolute. Gravity had won. But as the first strand of her hair brushed the stone, the trajectory of her fall was violently interrupted. A force, as immovable as a mountain and as sudden as a lightning strike, intercepted her. The world didn't hit her, a man did. And in the blur of her fading consciousness, she felt the crushing velocity of her fall transform into the terrifying security of an iron grip. The impact was not the cold strike of stone, but a collision with living heat. Hyeon-Jun had moved before the first crystal carafe even kissed the floor. He bridged the distance in a predatory blur, his shadow eclipsing the overhead lights as he lunged into the center of the disaster. One arm hooked beneath Anika's knees while his other hand clamped firmly around her waist, arresting her descent with a violent, bone-jarring precision. The sheer momentum of her collapse pulled her into him, her head snapping back before coming to rest against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest. There was a sudden, vacuum-like silence as the room realized the tray had shattered, but the woman had not. In the high-contrast glare of the chandeliers, the visual dissonance was jarring. Hyeon-Jun's hands, rugged and scarred, were locked tight against the delicate, pale blue fabric of Anika's uniform. His skin was a map of a different kind of life, the dark, intricate ink of a faded tattoo coiled around his wrist like a serpent, disappearing beneath the cuff of his expensive suit. The rough texture of his calloused palms pressed into the soft cotton of her dress, a stark reminder of the gulf between them, the protector who thrived in violence and the victim who had been nearly unmade by it. He stood like an iron pillar amidst the wreckage of glass and spilled wine, his breathing heavy but controlled. Anika felt like a ghost in his grip, her body entirely limp, a dead weight that he supported without a hint of strain. The scent of him, something sharp, like ozone and expensive cedar, began to cut through the haze of her unconsciousness. The bystanders remained frozen, their mouths agape, phones half raised to capture the scandal, but Hyeon-Jun didn't see them. He didn't see the panicked manager rushing toward them or the droplets of red wine staining the hem of his trousers. His entire universe had narrowed down to the woman trembling in his arms. He could feel the erratic, hummingbird beat of her heart through the thin fabric of her uniform, and more importantly, he felt the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. He shifted her slightly, his grip tightening as if he expected someone to try and take her from him. As he adjusted his arm to better support her weight, his hand slid upward, his fingers grazing the underside of her sleeve. He wasn't looking for a secret, but as the fabric bunched beneath his touch, he felt the texture of her skin change, not smooth, but swollen and rigid. He froze. His eyes, which had been scanning her pale face for signs of life, dropped to where his hand met her arm. A low, dangerous vibration started in his chest, a sound that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a growl. The iron grip didn't just hold her now, it claimed her. The silence in the ballroom was brittle, the kind of stillness that precedes a landslide. Hyeon-Jun's hand remained anchored to Anika's upper arm, his thumb hooked under the edge of her sleeve. As he shifted his weight to fully stand, the tension in the fabric gave way. The crisp, white cotton slid upward, retreating like a tide to reveal the shore of her skin. Under the clinical, unforgiving brilliance of the overhead chandeliers, the secret Anika had bled for was finally dragged into the light. The bruise was a horrific, blooming galaxy of trauma. It was larger than any mere stumble could account for, a deep, obsidian core that bled outward into sickly violets and raw, angry ochres. The edges were defined by the unmistakable ghost of 4 fingers and a thumb, a signature of violence etched into her mahogany skin. It wasn't just an injury, it was a map of a struggle, a permanent record of a moment where someone had tried to break her. The warm, golden glow of the gala's ambient lighting hit the site of the trauma, making the swelling appear almost three-dimensional. There was no concealing it now. The thick, artificial paste she had applied that morning had been rubbed away by the friction of her fall and the heat of her fever, leaving the truth bare and undeniable. Hyeon-Jun's gaze, which had been frantic with the concern of a first responder, suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto the mark, tracking the curve of the fingerprints pressed into her flesh. He didn't blink. He didn't look back at her face. The air around him seemed to solidify, turning cold and sharp enough to cut. The rugged, tattooed hand that held her arm didn't pull away in disgust, instead, it tightened with a possessive, trembling intensity. Around them, the oblivious elites began to lean in. A woman in a silk gown gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she caught sight of the discoloration. A man in a tailored tuxedo took a half-step back, his eyes darting toward the exit, as if the mere presence of Anika's pain was a contagion he couldn't afford to catch. The social weight of the room shifted from shock at a fallen tray to the heavy, suffocating realization that a crime had been committed in their presence. Anika remained limp, her head lolling against Hyeon-Jun's shoulder, her eyes still closed to the world that was finally seeing her. She was spared the sight of their pity and their horror. But Hyeon-Jun saw all of it. He saw the bruise, he saw the crowd, and he saw the invisible monster that had followed her into this room. The dangerous stranger was gone, replaced by something far more focused. The truth had been exposed, and in the dark corners of Hyeon-Jun's mind, the list of names for his retribution had just begun to form. The silence radiating from Hyeon-Jun was no longer the absence of sound, it was a physical pressure, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the ballroom. His jaw was a ridge of jagged stone, the muscles in his neck cording with a tension that made the faded ink of his tattoo appear to writhe against his skin. He didn't look at the gala manager, who was stammering about liability and medical assistance. He didn't look at the silver shards of the crystal tray. His eyes, narrowed into lethal slits, remained anchored to the blooming violet trauma on Anika's arm. In that moment, the dangerous stranger didn't call for a doctor. He didn't reach for his phone to dial 911. To Hyeon-Jun, a siren was a signal for the world to interfere, and he was done letting the world fail this woman. His mind, honed by years of navigating the city's coldest shadows, moved with a terrifying, singular focus. He wasn't looking for help, he was looking for a target. He began to scan the room. He ignored the panicked socialites and the frantic staff. Instead, his gaze cut through the crowd like a thermal lens, searching for the anomaly. He was looking for the men whose eyes held a different kind of fear, the men whose guilt would manifest as a sudden urge to flee or a reflexive tightening of his own fists. Hyeon-Jun knew the psychology of the coward. He knew that whoever had left those fingerprints on Anika's mahogany skin wouldn't be far, they were the kind who stayed close to ensure their victim remained silent. A low, guttural vibration hummed in his chest, a sound born of a fury so ancient and deep it felt like it belonged to a different man. His grip on Anika remained incredibly tender, even as his internal temperature reached a boiling point. He pulled her closer, shielding the bruise from the gawking eyes of the elites with his own broad shoulder. The atmosphere in the grand crystal ballroom shifted. The music seemed to sour, and the light felt too bright, too clinical. The elites began to shuffle backward, sensing the change in the air, the sudden, sharp scent of ozone that precedes a catastrophic strike. They saw a man in a tuxedo holding a broken girl, but what they felt was a predator that had just found a scent. Hyeon-Jun's eyes stopped on a figure near the velvet-curtained exit, a man whose face had gone a sickly shade of gray. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the verdict was rendered. Hyeon-Jun didn't need a witness, a trial, or a confession. He had the bruise, and he had the target. The war he had declared wasn't going to be fought with words. As he began to move toward the door, carrying Anika's limp weight as if she were a feather, his expression remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. The controlled part of his rage was the most dangerous thing in the room. He wasn't going to explode, he was going to execute. The air around them seemed to fracture as Hyeon-Jun began to move, his stride steady despite the dead weight of the woman in his arms. He ignored the frantic whispers of the gala guests and the outstretched hands of the security detail, cutting through the gilded room like a blade through silk. He didn't stop until he reached the shadowed alcove of a heavy velvet curtain, a small pocket of temporary isolation away from the prying eyes of the ballroom. He lowered himself onto a stone bench, shifting Anika with a tenderness that contradicted the lethal tension in his frame. He cradled her head against the crook of his elbow, his fingers tangling in her loosened hair to keep her steady. The girl was still drifting, her breathing thin and reedy, her skin clammy against the heat of his palms. He looked down at the bruise again. Up close, in the dim amber light of the alcove, it looked even more like a confession. The way the skin had yellowed at the edges told him this wasn't the first time, the deep purple at the center told him the most recent strike had been intended to punish, not just to hurt. Hyeon-Jun leaned in, his face inches from hers. The sharp scent of his cologne mingled with the metallic tang of the spilled wine on her uniform. He wasn't looking for the crowd anymore. He was looking into the hollows of her closed eyes, searching for the person she was hiding behind that mask of stoic endurance. His voice came out as a low, guttural vibration, a sound felt more in the chest than heard in the ear. It carried the weight of a promise and the chill of an executioner's blade. "Anika," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her ear. "Open your eyes." She stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips as her consciousness fought its way through the fog of pain. Her eyelashes fluttered, and for a second, the brown of her irises met the obsidian intensity of his. She looked terrified, her instinct already reaching for the mask, her hand reflexively moving to pull her sleeve back down. Hyeon-Jun caught her wrist before she could hide the truth again. He didn't squeeze, but his grip was an absolute, iron boundary. He forced her to look at the mark, and then he forced her to look at him. "Don't hide it," he whispered, his tone dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "Not from me." He leaned closer still, his jaw tight enough to snap. "Tell me the name, Anika. Who did this to you?" The question hung in the air like a bared throat. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask how it happened. He asked for a target. And as Anika looked into the eyes of the dangerous stranger, she realized that for the first time in her life, the man holding her wasn't the one she needed to fear, he was the storm she was about to unleash. The murmur of the gala, once a polite hum of vanity, curdled into a cold, jagged silence. The onlookers, men in six-figure watches and women draped in the weight of heirlooms, had initially watched the scene with a detached, clinical pity. They had expected a medical emergency, a minor scandal involving a weak-willed girl and a heavy tray. But as the shadows deepened in the alcove and the dangerous stranger tightened his protective grip, the atmospheric pressure of the room shifted. The crowd began to recoil. It started with those closest to the velvet curtains, a physical retreat that rippled outward like a stone dropped in a stagnant pond. They didn't just see the bruise now, they saw the men holding the girl. Hyeon-Jun hadn't raised his voice, and he hadn't made a single aggressive movement toward the bystanders, yet the air around him hummed with the lethal frequency of a live wire. The socialites, who spent their lives navigating the subtleties of power, suddenly recognized a brand of authority that didn't come from a bank account or a family name. It was the primal, terrifying authority of a predator who had just been handed a reason to kill. His stillness was no longer the stillness of a guest, it was the stillness of a storm front seconds before the sky breaks open. "Should we call someone else?" a young woman whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched her husband's arm. "Don't," the man replied, his eyes fixed on the sharp, rugged profile of Hyeon-Jun. "Look at his hands. He isn't waiting for the police. He's waiting for a victim." The gala manager, a man who prided himself on controlling every variable, took a single step toward them, his hand raised as if to intervene. He stopped mid-stride. Hyeon-Jun's head turned just a fraction of an inch, his dark eyes cutting through the dim light to pin the manager where he stood. There was no warmth in that gaze, only a cold, calculating assessment of whether the man was an obstacle to be cleared. The manager's hand dropped to his side. He recognized the tattoo on Hyeon-Jun's wrist, the faded ink of a world that didn't follow the rules of the ballroom. He realized, with a sinking dread, that this wasn't a simple fainting spell. A hidden war had just spilled onto his marble floors, and the stranger holding the waitress was the one who was going to finish it. As the elites continued to shrink away, their faces pale reflections of the horror they had tried to ignore, the space around Hyeon-Jun and Anika became a sanctuary of shadow. The dangerous stranger had been awakened, and as he looked back down at the broken girl in his arms, the last traces of his cold detachment vanished. He was no longer a man trying to bury his past, he was a man using that past as a weapon to protect her future. Hyeon-Jun didn't wait for permission, and he certainly didn't wait for an ambulance. With a fluid, powerful heave, he stood fully upright, gathering Anika into his arms as if she were the only precious thing in a room full of gilded trash. Her head fell naturally into the crook of his neck, her shallow breaths warm against his skin, a fragile reminder of why his blood was currently turning to liquid fire. As he turned toward the main exit, two security guards in matching black blazers stepped into his path, their postures stiff with the uncertainty of how to handle a man who looked like he could dismantle them without breaking a sweat. "Sir, you can't take her out of the building," the taller one said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of Hyeon-Jun's stare. "Protocol requires we wait for the paramedics. We need to file a report." Hyeon-Jun didn't slow his pace. He didn't even shift his gaze from the doors ahead. "Move," he said, the word less a request and more a death sentence for the conversation. The guards hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts. But as Hyeon-Jun stepped into the light, the cording muscles of his neck and the dark, jagged ink on his wrist seemed to radiate a silent, terrifying promise. There was an aura of absolute ownership around him, a claim that had been staked the moment his hands touched her bruised skin. He wasn't just a guest leaving a party, he was a sovereign taking what belonged to him out of a hostile territory. "Sir," the guard started again, reaching out a tentative hand. Hyeon-Jun stopped, mere inches from the man's chest. The air between them turned cold. "She has spent her entire night being invisible to you," Hyeon-Jun whispered, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. "Now that she's broken, you want to follow protocol. If you touch her, or if you try to stop me from getting her to safety, I will show you exactly what protocol looks like in my world." The guard's hand dropped as if it had been burned. He looked into Hyeon-Jun's eyes and saw a void that no amount of gala lighting could touch. He stepped aside, his partner following suit, the two of them fading into the background like shadows retreating from a flame. Hyeon-Jun kicked the heavy oak doors open, the cool night air rushing in to replace the suffocating scent of the ballroom. He strode down the marble steps, ignoring the valet and the line of idling limousines. He didn't care about the scandal, the lost job, or the whispers that would follow his name. He had felt the way Anika's body had relaxed against him the moment they hit the fresh air, a tiny, subconscious surrender that told him she finally felt safe. He reached his black SUV, his fingers working the remote with a practiced flick. As he settled her into the leather interior with the gentleness of a man handling spun glass, he looked back at the glowing windows of the gala. The elites were still in there, tucked away in their world of lies. But Anika was out. She was his now, and the world was about to learn that when Hyeon-Jun Gim claimed something, he guarded it with a ferocity that left nothing but ashes in its wake. The first thing Anika felt was the silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of her apartment, the kind that held its breath waiting for a door to slam or a glass to break. This was a deep, velvet quiet that felt like a shield. Her eyelids felt like they had been stitched shut with lead. When she finally forced them open, she didn't see the familiar cracked ceiling or the flickering fluorescent light of her bathroom. Instead, she saw the soft, dancing shadows of a fireplace reflected on a dark coffered ceiling. She was lying on a sofa that felt like a cloud, wrapped in a blanket of heavy, charcoal cashmere that smelled faintly of cedar and ozone. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, jagged reminder flared in her ribs, and she let out a jagged gasp. Automatically, she reached for the sleeve of her uniform to hide the bruise, her heart hammering against her chest in a practiced panic. "Don't." The voice was a low rumble, coming from a wingback chair tucked into the shadows across the room. Hyeon-Jun sat there, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the full, intricate line of the tattoo climbing his neck. He wasn't looking at a phone or a book, he was looking at her with a terrifyingly calm intensity. "There is no one here you need to hide from," he said, his voice dropping to that vibration that felt like a physical touch. "And there is no one here who is going to hurt you again." Anika froze, her fingers still hovering near her arm. The instinct to lie, to say "I'm fine, I just tripped," rose to her throat like a reflex. But as she looked at him, really looked at the raw, honest anger still simmering in his eyes, the weight of the mask became too heavy to hold. The strength she had worn like armor for years suddenly felt like a cage of rusted iron. She let her hand fall. She let her sleeve stay pushed up, exposing the dark, ugly truth of her skin to the firelight. For the first time in a lifetime, she didn't suck in her breath to hide the ache in her ribs. She let her shoulders slump. She let the tears, hot and silent, finally track through the remnants of the gala makeup on her cheeks. She wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a survivor playing a part. She was just a woman in pain, and for the first time, that was allowed to be enough. Hyeon-Jun didn't move to comfort her with empty words. He simply leaned forward into the light, his jaw tight, acknowledging her agony with a silent, heavy respect. He watched her for a long moment, letting her breathe through the wreckage of her own silence. "Sleep," he commanded softly, though his eyes promised a storm. "When you wake again, the world will be different. I've already made sure of it." Hyeon-Jun waited until Anika's breathing deepened into the rhythmic cadence of true, exhausted sleep before he rose from the shadows. He moved with a predatory grace that the tuxedo had only barely managed to conceal, his silhouette cutting a sharp, jagged line against the dying embers of the hearth. He didn't look like a guest of the elite anymore, he looked like the shadow they all feared would eventually come for them. He walked to the heavy mahogany desk at the far end of the room and picked up his burner phone. His movements were clinical, stripped of the tenderness he had shown Anika. He scrolled through a series of high-resolution photos sent by his associates, men who lived in the cracks of the city's concrete. The images were clear, a man in a rumpled suit, caught by a street corner camera, pacing outside Anika's apartment with the frantic, twitchy energy of a coward who realized his prey had vanished. Hyeon-Jun's jaw tensed, the muscle jumping rhythmically. He recognized the type. A man who felt small in the world and sought to feel big by bruising someone smaller. A man who mistook Anika's resilience for permission. He pulled a black leather holster from a hidden drawer and checked the weight of the steel. It felt familiar, a cold, honest gravity. He didn't enjoy violence, but he respected its utility as a language for those who refused to listen to anything else. The tattoo on his wrist, a dark reminder of the debts he had paid in blood, seemed to thrum with a phantom heat. He had spent years trying to outrun the monster he used to be, but for Anika, he would invite the monster back to the table. He would give it a seat and a serrated blade. He didn't need to ask for directions. He didn't need to wait for the morning. In his world, justice wasn't something you waited for, it was something you took. He paused at the door, casting one final glance toward the sofa where Anika lay wrapped in his cashmere. She looked so small against the fabric, the dark stain of the bruise still visible where the blanket had slipped. That mark was a debt that had been transferred to him, and Hyeon-Jun Gim was a man who prided himself on settling accounts. He stepped out into the biting chill of the night, the heavy door clicking shut with the finality of a gavel. The hunt didn't require a fanfare or a frantic chase. It was a cold, calculated march toward a destination that had been written the moment her tray hit the marble. As he slid into the driver's seat and the engine let out a low, ominous growl, Hyeon-Jun gripped the steering wheel, his eyes reflecting the cold neon of the city. He wasn't just looking for a man, he was looking to erase a shadow. And by the time the sun rose, the person who had left that mark on Anika's arm would wish they had never learned her name. The dawn arrived not with a celebration, but with a quiet, somber clarity. The storm that had raged through the city's underbelly during the night had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and the shadows a little less crowded. Inside the sanctuary of the study, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing white embers, casting a soft, amber light over the room. Anika sat by the window, watching the first fingers of gold stretch across the skyline. She was dressed in an oversized sweater Hyeon-Jun had provided, the thick wool a comforting armor against the world. Her arm was bandaged, the throbbing ache replaced by a steady, manageable heat. For the first time in years, the crushing weight in her chest was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow lightness. She didn't have to look at the news or check her phone to know that the man who had haunted her life was gone. She could feel the absence of the threat in the very air she breathed. The heavy door creaked open, and Hyeon-Jun stepped in. He had changed his clothes, but the scent of the cold morning and something sharp, like spent gunpowder and rain, clung to him. His movements were slow, deliberate, the lethargy of a man who had finally finished a long, grim task. He didn't say a word as he walked to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water, bringing one to her. Their fingers brushed as she took the glass. There was no flinch this time, no reflexive pull for the mask. Anika looked up into his dark, tired eyes and saw the reflection of her own survival. He was a dangerous man, a man of blood and secrets, but he was also the only person who had ever looked at her wounds and chosen to carry the burden of them. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, rough vibration in the quiet room. Anika nodded, her throat tight. "Why did you do it?" Hyeon-Jun leaned against the window frame, looking out at the city he had just reshaped for her. "Because some things are worth breaking the silence for," he murmured. "And because I'm tired of being the only monster in the room." A new alliance had been forged in the wreckage of the gala and the shadows of the night. It wasn't a fairy tale, there were no promises of easy days or forgotten scars. It was a pact made between 2 people who understood that strength wasn't about how much pain you could endure alone, but about having the courage to let someone else stand in the gap. Anika reached out, her hand resting tentatively on his tattooed wrist, the iron grip that had caught her when the world let her fall. He didn't pull away. In the rising light of the new day, the waitress and the stranger stood together, 2 ghosts who had decided to stop haunting their own lives and start living them. The war was over, but the story of their shadow-bound protection was only just beginning. The world often mistakes endurance for power, and Anika Brown had been the world's most convincing liar. For years, she had carried her trauma like a hidden flame, convinced that as long as she didn't scream, she wasn't truly burning. She had built a temple out of her own silence, believing that her ability to absorb a blow, to mask a bruise, and to walk through a crowded room while her ribs screamed was the ultimate proof of her worth. But as she sat in the quiet dawn of Hyeon-Jun's study, she finally understood the cost of that solitary architecture. Silence does not heal the wound, it only provides the dark, stagnant air required for the rot to spread. To hide the pain is to give it a home where it can grow undisturbed until the structural integrity of the soul finally gives way. She had pushed herself to the physiological limit, not out of strength, but out of a desperate, lonely fear that her brokenness made her a burden the world would simply discard. She looked at Hyeon-Jun, a man who had spent his life in the shadows but chose to step into the light for the sake of her scars. She realized then that true strength is not found in the iron-willed refusal to fall. It is found in the terrifying, vulnerable moment of letting go. It is the courage to be seen in the wreckage, to stop the frantic patching of the mask, and to allow someone else to reach into the darkness and help carry the weight. Anika's collapse hadn't been her end, it had been her liberation. The moment her tray hit the marble and her secret was dragged into the light, the rot lost its power. She had spent a lifetime trying to be unbreakable, only to discover that the most beautiful things are often the ones that have been shattered and pieced back together with a hand that knows how to hold them. As the sun fully cleared the horizon, she took a breath, deep, ragged, and for the first time, honest. The weight was still there, but it was no longer hers alone to bear. The dangerous stranger had taught her what a lifetime of survival never could, that while silence is a shield, it is also a coffin. And to live, truly live, one must be willing to let the shield drop and trust that there is a grip strong enough to catch the pieces when they fall.